A Time to Stir, Columbia, 1968. Paul Cronin, editor. Introduction. April 1968. Hundreds of emboldened Columbia University students, many allied to two groups, Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and Students Afro-American Society, SAS, take direct action against what they regard as the university's racist and militaristic policies by barricading themselves inside 5 buildings on campus. All of them together behind locked doors with a unified vision, issuing demands. Columbia must end construction of a gymnasium in nearby Morningside Park. Public parkland situation within a primarily Black neighborhood, Jim Crow must go. And disaffiliate with the Institute for Defense Analyses, the IDA, which is conducting weapons research for the Department of Defense and so connects Columbia to the war in Vietnam. Immediately are unleashed and made crystal clear the schisms that have long existed on campus. As Columbia's unresponsive administration, controlled by businessmen trustees and overseen by a dithering president, attempts to diffuse the situation, as faculty meet and discuss the issues, as undergraduates opposed to the occupiers mobilize a raging reaction to their classmates' rebellion, hundreds of New York City police officers are assembling. After 6 days, with neither side leaning toward compromise, with no hope of reconciliation, law enforcement officials removed the protesters, more than 700, of whom nearly 200 are not Columbia students, from their makeshift self-governing communes, one of which is held exclusively by Black students. The bust has a clarifying effect on many who otherwise would have paid little attention to the world of politics around them. Students who had sidestepped the protests, who never would have thought of involving themselves in disruption of any kind, are galvanized. And a fresh wave of turmoil surges across Columbia, helping to set in motion similar actions at colleges and universities, public, private, rural, and urban, across the United States. The social and political issues that had energized the campus and the student protest movement for years reflected a formidable and transformative populist uprising that was engulfing whole swaths of the nation, even the globe, a rejoinder to the perceived inadequacies of mainstream institutions and politics. By 1968, in the shadow of a war that was pulling in hundreds of thousands of young American men, and only 3 weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Columbia University, so close to the center of the world's media industries and even closer to the African-American community in West Harlem, became one place where the academy's plight during the Vietnam quagmire and the culture wars of the era were conspicuously played out. A Time to Stir presents several dozen first-hand testimonies from a cross-section of participants of those events in 1968, many of whom never before have written about their experiences of this dramatic event, all bringing with them insights gleaned from past half-century. The group includes members of the Columbia chapter of the SDS, women from Barnard College, 2 students of architecture and urban planning, a student lawyer in training, members of each of the 4 white-held buildings, including some resistant to SDS militancy, 6 representatives of the Black-only occupied Hamilton Hall, a longtime resident of the Columbia neighborhood, 1 student involved in community organizing in Harlem, another in Campus Draft Dodging Council, the president of Columbia University Student Council, a journalist from the Underground Press, 2 outside agitators, several members of the Columbia faculty, a prosecutor from the district attorney's office, an aide to the New York City Mayor John Lindsay, Columbia undergraduates who objected to the building occupations, students who worked at Columbia's WKCR radio station and Spectator newspaper, 2 police officers who helped clear the occupied buildings, and members of moderate groups, Students for a Restructured University and alumni for a New Columbia. 2 of the shrewdest political commentators working in the United States today, Paul Berman and Juan Gonzalez, both intimately involved in the events in 1968 at Columbia, have offered up respectively a forward and an afterwards. The book opens with the chronology of events. drawn from reports from the Columbia Daily Spectator student newspaper and subsequent book written by Spectator's dogged journalists entitled Up Against the Ivy Wall, and details incidents from the 1966 to 67 and 67 to 68 academic years. By presenting such an array of perspectives, A Time to Stir tells the compelling story of the unprecedented protests that paralyzed an Ivy League institution. The book documents this watershed moment and the debates that animated it by pulling on myriad threads, but at its core must inevitably be the students behind the inciting incident, to whom everyone else responded. In their stories, we learn about the disillusionment of male undergraduates at Columbia College, the pent-up frustrations, the persistent and earnest activism, and the spontaneous occupation of 5 buildings by what student leader Mark Rudd described as a motley mob. Here was a ragtag collection of disaffected constituencies, a crowd passionate, polemical, and relying on instinct with diverse political commitments, but commonality of purpose, brought together by circumstance and a series of improvisational encounters with a more or less group-centered leadership. Each occupied building quickly developed its own personality, drawing on a particular kind of activist. Lowe, Avery, mathematics, and the Fairweather became dynamic enclaves packed with hundreds of undergraduates and graduate students, holed up side by side with a host of sympathetic outsiders who suspected that Columbia would prove fertile recruiting ground for action on the streets beyond campus. Of vital importance, too, often forgotten today, or more likely simply unknown, was the fact that Hamilton Hall was held by a group of contemplated, disciplined Black Columbia students who proved to be the strategic and moral centrifuge for the protests. For these men and women pledged to the ideal of self-determination, some enthralled by the rise of Black power, the act of closing ranks was made easier by the fact that most already knew each other. Initially suspect of the level of commitment of white students, and with practical support offered by Harlem locals, these Black students were, from the start, on a different trajectory than the other protesters. Every individual on the Columbia campus in 1968, no matter whose company they sought or kept, which organization or ideology they aligned themselves with, how committed they were to allegiances, or how fiercely they vowed to remain unaffiliated, was motivated by different reasons. With the enduring absence of a monolithic student bloc, with pulses beating ever faster and stunning lack of stability of the situation, with rival factions proliferating by the day, consensus and conciliation would never be easy to reach. There wasn't a groupsicle that was not at one time or another at odds with every other groupsicle. This was a contest of ideas, a confluence of mismatched concerns, making for an extraordinarily stimulating learning curve that no one had ever before experienced. Whether aware of it or not, everyone active in the protests was showing one another, once the textbooks were put away and the classroom doors were sealed, how living through a historical moment could be an educational windfall, a potent form of education. As several of those who have contributed their memories to the book make clear, the tumult had been brewing for years. Study The Spectator from 1965 onward. Read about the centralized administration offering paper-thin promises and desperate to prevent dissent from upsetting its fundraising efforts, along with a marked acceleration of student protests and voice raising, a drive towards transition and extreme measures, the jettisoning of complacency and the censoring of conformity, an expanding number of single-issue political groups operating on campus, provocative anti-war gatherings around New York involving Columbia students, the steady and sometimes reluctant abandonment of conventional moderate tactics as seen through the increasingly contentious campus rallies, including protests against the Reserve Officers Training Corps and recruitment by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Marine Corps, students involving themselves in community outreach in Harlem, civil rights activism and furor over the draft and the prospect of conscription and the brutality of the Vietnam body count, demonstrations at the site of Columbia's proposed gymnasium, heated student and faculty responses to the university's heavy-handed purchasing of neighborhood buildings and subsequent evictions, and picketing of Columbia dining halls in support of better conditions for its workers. Each of these actions then fueled the next. You're worried about your grades? Are you being thrown out of Columbia? Consequences be damned. By 1968, it was clear that students were becoming a vital and effective political voice, and the inflexible university administrators across the nation would be unwise to ignore calls for change. Demands from students to become part of the decision-making process were thunderous, with relevance a new watchword when it came to curriculum reform. But change could come only if workable channels of communications and possibilities for meaningful dialogue existed. And many vocal students felt that those who ruled Columbia had constructed a paternalistic, archaic culture of opaqueness. See Dan Pellegrin's essay with its mention of Student Life Report in October 1965. David Truman, then the dean of Columbia College, spoke to an interviewer about student civil disobedience, declaring, "The circumstances under which such protests would be acceptable are extremely rare." As with Berkeley in 1964, the battleground became one of free speech. On the first day of the fall of 1967 semester, an attempt to stave off disruption, a ban on protest inside campus buildings was instituted. Columbia students were part of a cohort of headstrong youngsters immersed in a set of subcultures that by 1968 had permeated deeply and were helping to cultivate in millions of people a sense of personal responsibility for institutional behavior. Many of them, for the first time in their lives, saw the necessity for direct action. This may have been a coterie of ludic, hedonistic hipsters who gravitated to the subterranean downtown festivities, smoked dope, and hung out in the cafes, or just lingered in dorm rooms sprinkled with psychedelia and burning incense. But there was a counterpoint. This was also a nucleus of sincere bookish students who just as often could be found at the uptown end of a one train, standing on the Sundial Center at Columbia campus, drawing in fellow students with precocious analyses of world affairs, of leftist politics, fastidiously recounting frank historical narratives largely unavailable in the mainstream press, deflecting criticisms and fielding questions. Some of them, like Berkeley 64 compatriots, had gone south to assist in civil rights organizations with voter registration and educational programs. Others, too young for that, had been taken by parents to the nation's capital in 1963 to hear Martin Luther King Jr. enthrall the nation. Some were classic red or pink diaper babies, children devoted to New Deal Democrats. A few had parents who had suffered under McCarthy or were survivors of the European Holocaust. Still so fresh in mind, some had cousins who had fought in Spain, who had copies of Paul Goodman, David Reisman, and C. Wright Mills about the place, who subscribed to the National Guardian and the muckraking of I.F. Stone's Weekly, that warehouse of subversion. This was, all in all, by 1968, a hyper-politicized group, incredibly influenced and schooled by television industry of Operation Rolling Thunder's Jungle War, Bull Connor's Dogs, plus the duck and cover absurdity of mutually assured destruction. These rapturous, sloganeering students were swept up in the whirlwind, inflamed by a feverish, idealistic conviction that the hour for action had arrived. Behind the brick walls of the campus inside the occupied building, some kind of conversation experience was occurring, with great leaps of faith being taken, with boundaries being dissolved, the negation of alienation finally, if temporarily achievable. The challenges came from all directions, including a battalion of Columbia students who declared the occupiers' tactics were an affront to the intellectual spirit of the university. Anxious to show the world that another face of Columbia existed, counter-protesters were determined to neutralize the infectious, invasive demonstrations by retaliating against the morosity and marching feet around them. These short-haired, suit and tied athletes, the jocks, weren't necessarily opposed to the final aims and long-range goals of the protesters, the fugues, who had immobilized the campus and shut down classes, but would have preferred at the very least that some sort of rational persuasion be practiced instead. There shall be no use of coercion, disruption, or blackmail to influence the future of this great academic institution," read a flyer produced by a coalition of groups worried about escalating violence on campus and staggered by Columbia administration's inaction, progressively ready to take matters into their own hands. "Numbers and reason, not force or emotionalism, shall decide." The largest mass of students, those cautious tenderfoots, stood on the sidelines, struggling to understand precisely what was going on, but knowing enough that they couldn't let this historic moment pass them by. Through the maelstrom stumbled an incredulous, outdated, and painfully vulnerable university administration, ill-equipped for the problem-solving tasks with which it suddenly was faced, accused of having its reputation tarnished by incestuous connections with the New York power elite and, more broadly, the nation's establishment matrix. Foot soldiers from the mainstream media and underground press congregated on campus, cameras rolling and typewriters at the ready, transforming a few square blocks of Morningside Heights into a fishbowl for the entire world to stare into. They installed themselves when the New York City Police Department in clutches of concerned parents, bearing chicken soup and bail money, weren't taking up space. It might be said that the efforts for everyone at Columbia during those days was both legitimate and inappropriate. To everyone conducted themselves both honorably and improperly. To be sure, everyone made mistakes. The faculty, for example, only a small number of whom would have considered themselves radical, advanced itself as an honest broker, but immediately lost its footing, revealing how powerless it really was, and was for the most part refused to take genuine political stance. And almost overnight, the liberal professors, convinced the campus was a sanctuary protected at all costs, became in the mind of radical students a lost cause. Some who had long been identified as progressive were overtaken by events and, like their hardline colleagues, found themselves dubbed reactionary dinosaurs. As Columbia professor of French, Richard Greenman explained in the 1968 essay, faculty sympathetic to the aims of the student dissidents who were considered their tactics coercive were hypocrites and cowards. These people, wrote Greenman, would never have dared taking a position on the gym, of which they all disapproved, had it not been for the mass student pressure from below expressed through direct action. That pressure came almost vehemently from adaptive, swaggering 20-year-old rebels who were learning as they went along, a bullheaded sliver of whom were drawn to the Bolshevik notion of the vanguard and the heroic guerrilla Chase-Foucault theory, to the cadre's leadership and of an armed insurrection. That's out of date. Aspiring Columbia SDSers were being told by 1968 of the Port Huron Statement, the organization's relatively placid and reformist Jeffersonian founding statement, issued 6 years earlier. We're reading Lenin's State and Revolution and Che's speeches by now. The activities of these agitators, with little regard for the potentially damaging consequences of their strategy, ran counter to the hierarchical participatory democracy that blossomed amid the often joyous central atmosphere of the occupied buildings. The restructuring of the university, for example, in the months that followed, became a focus of graduate students, was deemed by them a hopeless and co-optive act. Some firebrands were intent on turning the campus into little more than a staging ground for their revolutionary aims, and it is no surprise that a direct line can be drawn from Columbia 68 to the infamy of the Weathermen. Years later, novelist and mathematics occupier Paul Auster wrote that in 1968 was the year he went crazy. A Time to Stir suggests that the real story isn't what the tribe did once they reached that frenzied state, but how they became crazy. However, one feels that what happened at Columbia University in 1968, the events, and the contents of this book serve as a rich case study, an opportunity to investigate broad themes, not only relevant to the campus events, but also emblematic issues of the late 60s. The role and responsibility of democratic citizenship. Throughout American history, citizens have used a variety of means: political organizations, voluntary associations, journals of opinion, public rallies and protests to exercise their democratic rights and make the political and policy preferences known to elected officials. Few periods of American history were as fecund and chaotic, with such revitalizing expressions of citizen activism as the 60s. especially in terms of the creation and use of grassroots democratic tools, most prominently in the form of social change movements, often led by those feeling marginalized by mainstream politics. In 1960, Columbia professor Daniel Bell noted in The End of Ideology that one can have causes and passions only when one knows against whom to fight. Before asking today, intellectually and emotionally, who is the enemy that one can fight? By the end of the decade, for some students at Columbia University, with their heightened consciousness and list of interlocking grievances, that question was all too easy to answer. The year 1968 tested the seams of the American quilt like no other, and the deluge of anti-war protests and student activism in the second half of the 60s is a significant chapter in the story of post-war democratic inventiveness and effectiveness. Fundamental questions were raised about the citizens' ethical responsibilities to counter laws and politics considered unjust or legal. Inequitable mandates needed to be defined. Where previously apathy was the standard, dissent thrived. Dissent became protest, from protest to resistance. Resistance overtaken by confrontation. Confrontation jumped to militancy. The range of strategies employed by students to facilitate change on campus and beyond represented a vivid challenge to the assumption that authorities should be respected without question. Disruptive insurgency ruled the day. There would be no business as usual. In his 2016 obituary for human rights attorney and activist Michael Ratner, one of the few Columbia law students who plunged into the protests in 1968, David Cole wrote, Ratner knew that when you sue the powerful, you will often lose. But he also understood that such suits could prompt political action and that advocacy inspired by a lawsuit was often more important in achieving justice than the litigation itself. These lines were plain the idea expressed as early as June 1968 in Ramparts magazine. Columbia was no revolution because those who created it could never really hope to take power. Students went straight to the heart of a mighty university, one backed by New York's legal, political, and media power industries. Armed with little more than slingshots, many figured it likely would be an impossible fight, even with the global spirit of rebellion behind them, even when in solidarity with compadres on other continents. But at Columbia in April and May 1968, a prototype operation was presented to the world. Within days of the events, newspapers reported copycat happenings across the country. Given the plans for the gymnasium needed to be abandoned, and Columbia's disaffiliation from the IDA was a non-negotiable issue, students felt that they were committing a justified act of non-violent civil disobedience. Needless to say, some saw it differently, urging that the occupations upset the rightful order of institutional procedure and jeopardized the university's special status as a much-needed enclave set apart from politics, war making, and the like. What happened to the campus as a bastion of steady maintenance of basic notions and practices of academic freedom? What good could ever come from shutting down a university and inflicting upon it a potentially mortal wound? Richard Nixon, declaiming against anarchy and stumping for law and order, trumpeted Columbia 68 as the first volleying attempts by a lunatic fringe to seize control of the nation's campuses, while J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation used the events as a pretext to go after New Left organizations with a fervor. Michael Newman, in his contribution to his book, this book, writes that what the campus protests might have achieved beyond the boundaries of Morningside Heights is scarcely worth thinking about. His trenchant case against Columbia 68 begins with accusations that the insular, self-satisfied protesters, relishing in carnivalesque atmosphere, were more involved with therapeutic self-expression than any kind of meaningful political activity. Todd Gilton famously noted that while the right was occupying the heights in the political system, the assemblage of groups identified with the left were marching on the English department. The gym and the IDA were, of course, to a certain extent, only pretext, spur to action. Yet the symbolic value of the protest, bringing the war home, was pivotal. As Eleanor Stein writes in her essay, symbolism is enormously important, motivating, inspiring, and engaging aspect of human existence and life. Such debate frames one of the central issues of A Time to Stir. What is it that constitutes legitimate and effective political action, especially when it emerges from the ground up, from those with limited power? The role of the university in American society. In the final years of the 60s, Columbia University displayed in crisp focus the crisis of liberal academy amid the cultural, racial, and political dramas of the time. Of protesting students, renowned historian and Columbia University history professor Richard Hofstadter noted in 1968, to imagine that the best way to change social order is to start by assaulting its most accessible centers of thought and study and criticism is not only to show complete disregard for the intrinsic character of the university, but also to develop a curiously self-destructive strategy for social change. But for Columbia students, what better place to vent their anger? The doctrine of academic freedom prevented the university administration from openly opposing the pointless war being waged in Vietnam, even while many of its faculty and students, as well as President Grayson Kirk and then Vice President David Truman, did so with mounting conviction. More troubling was the fact that faculty members were consultants for the IDA, on the board of which Columbia president served, thus giving the university an appearance of connivance with the war. Students saw this as a sign of hypocrisy, the worst marker of academic complicity in the military change of command. At the same time, Columbia's practical need for space and expanded facilities resulted in a land grab from a public park in West Harlem, an eerie echo to the kinds of thefts of property and persons familiar in previous centuries. What better indication that a vast gymnasium with a symbolically segregationist back door did anyone need to understand that Columbia, expected to have evolved even an enlightened approach to racial politics and the interaction between town and gown, was so shamefully out of step with the era? The gym proved to be just one element of the university's nefarious, exclusionary dealings in Morningside Heights, with its sanitation in the neighborhood and removal of the undesirables from newly purchased residential buildings. More generally, after the free speech protests at Berkeley in 1964, students realized of themselves as cogs in a faceless bureaucratic system, as personnel to be molded, and it became increasingly ubiquitous. This stoked the enemy and resistance of its young charges, sullying the notion of Columbia as a virtuous community of scholars. For many students, Columbia, though smaller than public universities such as Berkeley, the size of which encouraged protests on a larger scale, did not provide the cohesive collegiate experience that its status in the Ivy League seemed to promise. As the report of the President's Commission on Campus Unrest stated in 1970, too many faculty appeared to the average freshman as, well, more like corporate executive than cloistered scholars. More committed to academic training than prepared students to fit the requirement for Cold War militarism than anything else. Disenchanted with an unhappy understanding of the coercive university as embodiment of the outside world, these youngsters have been steadily disabused of the notion that the ivory tower was a neutral energy, able to keep its hands clean of the Vietnam War and institutional racism. As Columbia student radical David Gilbert wrote in 1968, the stresses of American higher education were dedicated to the social functions required by modern capitalism. These issues were exacerbated for students of color, with the university's handful of Black students resentful of a distant or responsive and overwhelmingly white institution. Columbia's core curriculum, requiring undergraduates to study classics and Western civilization's literary and philosophical heritage, was for some an impressive celebration of imperialist values. Recent acknowledgments by antebellum universities of their participation in the slave trade have generated a new and robust reckoning of how intimately and interwoven the academy was with systemic oppression. Racial injustice in 60s America. 3 weeks before Columbia students occupied the campus, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, setting in motion a furious, grief-stricken response throughout the nation's urban communities that led to many deaths. King's murder contributed to a decisive shift within the civil rights movement from nonviolence and peaceful self-defense to Black power, a militant demand for Black freedom. These changes manifested themselves at Columbia in early 1968 with a change in SAS leadership, and then after the joint SDS-SAS rally and a sit-in at Hamilton Hall, the poignant, if brief, flash of interracial solidarity, with SAS telling white Columbia students that they had to depart Hamilton and hold their own building. This segregationist move recapitulated the wider and mimicked the larger structures as articulated by the Student Nonviolent Coordinate Committee, SNCC. In a 1966 statement, SNCC explained that white people who desire change in this country to go where that problem of racism is most manifest. Reflecting the call for white activists to leave the South and head home to the urban North, the dawn on April 24 protesting white Columbia students accused of indecision, feeling rejected and downhearted, departed Hamilton as requested by their Black comrades. The doors barricaded behind them. This small group moved across campus and smashed their way into the president's office in Lowell Library, the university's main administrative building. The community of common commitment was still there, but a new chapter in the fragile allegiance between Black and whites at Columbia was beginning. Hamilton Hall remained Black only for the rest of the week-long occupation, under the leadership of SAS, which asserted that above all, it represented the interests of Harlem's working-class community. The entrance into Hamilton of Stokely Carmichael, the former SNCC chairman, and H.R. Brown, the current SNCC chairman, on April 26 linked Columbia to a wider spectrum of societal concerns. Whether or not white SDSers were aware of it at the time, SAS's control of Hamilton provided the basis for the sustained occupation of not just that building, but the four others too, primarily because the NYPD were fearful of how Harlem might respond if they moved in to clear the campus. As such, the importance of Hamilton, renamed by the students Malcolm X Hall, cannot be overstated. By closing ranks the way they did, efficiently and peaceably, the inhabitants demonstrated that Black power ideology wasn't necessarily the incendiary polar opposite of the civil rights movement. Instead, when put into practice, its approach represented a carefully structured and restrained operation, displaying tactical skill and moral fortitude. The Black students' actions were made all more compelling when one considers the risks they were taking in invading private property of the rich and powerful. For white students, there were likely to be few serious negative repercussions, and especially no threat to life and limb. For African Americans, who could not expect such a soft landing, for whom the recent killings in February 1968 of 3 Black students in Orangeburg, South Carolina, reverberated far more strongly, the situation was different. Unlike some white students, they saw no nobility in being arrested and beaten up, or worse. Juan Gonzalez, author of this book's Afterward, recalls in interviews that within hours of the occupation of Hamilton Hall, he saw guns inside the building, brought in by Harlemites determined to prevent any overreaction by the authorities. Participatory democracy. Even as the United States had been a dynamic society whose promise of equality, liberty, and freedom of expression had offered the American people a great opportunity, those same values have also produced intense social tension. Time and again, citizens have wrestled with the need for change. In the 60s, the conflict between those who advocated rapid, even radical adjustment, and those who committed to traditional ideas of political and social order was made manifest across the country. From small town politics to national debate, from inner cities to remote academic enclaves, Columbia University was a focal point for that contest, one of the sites where the new radical activism was emerging. The self-rule developed within the optimism of the occupied buildings, filled with people who envisioned a society in which citizens who would fully share in the decisions shaping their lives, was a memorable reflection of Thoreau's call. Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence. It was truly a mass movement, enmeshed in situations of unusual turmoil, fluidity, and occasionally histrionics, that shook Columbia's foundations, even if the media threw up Mark Rudd as the anti-hero of the hour, and even if a number of protesters clearly moved beyond tactics that were perceived by most as strategically acceptable. By 1968 at Columbia, influence had flowed into the hands of a small group of voluble and well-read Mao, Debray, Gramsci, fan, and SDSers whose approach differed markedly from traditional nonviolent New Left ideology. With long-range goals and feeling betrayed by spineless liberalism, they had been, by 1968, engaged in the political activity and base building via strategizing, dorm canvassing, teach-ins, meetings, and rallies, and the writing and distribution of petitions and broadsides. Once the 5 buildings were taken and everyone knew the NYPD would soon be arriving and the media spectacle swelling, day after day the protesters were demonized on the front page of the New York Times. These advocates were somehow in the pilot seat, at least to the extent that they were able to set a context and wield influence for 3 or 4 days. This small faction believed it could be the single force, the spark, capable of igniting a powerful revolutionary spirit, and that in response, the power of the state through violent police action would reveal itself, thus pulling off the fence of those who previously were unresponsive to SDS appeals. The authoritarianism that marked this tiny minority of protesters meant they clashed with many inside buildings and were accused of practicing manipulatory democracy. Note that the essay by Joshua Rubinstein, who, while inside Fairweather, confronted and resisted what he felt were the SDS strong-arm tactics. Contributions from Nancy Bieberman and Carolyn Rusty Eisenberg are revealing in different ways as they touch on SDS's macho, unegalitarian tendencies with its treatment of women. In the years, months, even before the full power of the women's movement took hold, according to a common line from female interviewees that experience of the occupation, the men told us they had important work to do and that we should go make sandwiches. The emancipation of female Barnard College students did not begin inside Fairweather Hall, yet looking back, both women and men of the movement acknowledged that the seeds of consciousness were starting to take root. In his book about Berkeley free speech movement, activist Mario Savio Robert Cohen writes of the historicizing of the New Left, the suggestion of some scholars and activists that the movement's approach to grassroots organizing during its early years was democratic, nonviolent, non-dogmatic, and innovative. This phrase is followed by an implosive, irrevocable period of alienation, cynicism, and revolutionary fantasies. Other, mostly younger historians, adds Cohen, see the historical progression differently, proposing that alongside the sectarian and split apart SDS came mass protests surged on the campuses. Within the context of what is today known as the good 60s, bad 60s interpretation, Columbia 68 can be looked on as a temporal hinge, the moment when the tone darkened and for some, revolutionary fantasies became more harmful than anything else. At the same time, while the hothead Morningside Heights revolutionaries always shouted the loudest, they were the only ever a small proportion of the protest movement, one that grew in pragmatic strength, both on and off campus, following the bombings of Cambodia and the killings at Kent State. What of the protesters today? Well, what came next? Although for some participants, there was certainly a performative apolitical aspect to time inside the buildings, see Gene Slater's essay, for many, the rebellion signaled a shift of priorities that sent them down a path of social engagement that they have been walking ever since. As Thomas Paine wrote of panics, they might last only a short time, but the mind soon grows through them and acquires a firmer habit than before. The late Alan Silver, a Columbia sociology professor who fumed against the protesters, insisting that they had violated basic rules, and described his best students of those years, including Ted Gold, killed in 1970 when a bomb he and his colleagues were making in Greenwich Village townhouse accidentally exploded, as among the most incandescently brilliant he had ever taught. Look at the student publications from the period, as well as the many flyers and handouts produced, and note the sophistication of written material produced by 20-year-olds. Beyond their obviously fierce intelligence, this is a group that has long estranged itself from apathy and inertia. To this day, many of the campus protesters remain politically ambiguous, committed to social change, and have in their own ways continued to practice Marcuse's liberating great refusal. One hears all too often about the 60s radical turned company man, Jerry Rubin syndrome. But take a cross-section of the most active Columbia protesters, and today find a group of committed retirees, still suffused by the consciousness-raising energy of the 60s. Unlike so many youthful protesters in 1968, today's activists have a generation or two of knowledgeable, contrarian grandparents, often networked together, still challenging the status quo, to call on for guidance and counsel when it comes to facing any number of travails, political and otherwise. Given the exigencies of raising children and paying the mortgage, say nothing of the predicaments of old age, a certain level of engagement has inevitably slipped away. But as we come face to face with the new threats and embark on our own epochal battles, these folks can school us in how to confront the long odds and hard knocks to help us understand our shared experiences. They are available to tutor us out of quiescence, to show us how to build the spirit, to stave off discouragement, and as one obstacle morphs into the next. Among the veterans of the Avery Commune, which is a school of architecture, who I interviewed, for example, are no billionaire property developers. Instead, only socially conscious designers, urban planners, and community developers. In his Gates of Eden, American Culture in the 60s, Morris Dickstein, an assistant professor of English at Columbia in 1968, wrote of the 20th anniversary celebrations of 1968, a campus meeting of strike veterans. For Dickstein, it was remarkable how many had somehow remained true to their ideas. Few, it seems, had just gone for the money, despite the Gilded Age ethics of the Reagan years. It was clear that some sense of community responsibility would continue to shape the remainder of their lives. And indeed it has. Something I can attest to, having caught up with the many hundreds of Columbia protest veterans, public servants, doctors, teachers, academics, writers, some 30 years after Dickstein. Mark Rudd, these days working as intensely and urgently as he was 5 decades ago, over the years have been an especially important presence for me. An energetic, compassionate rabble-rouser, currently training youth leadership in strategic organizing and how to build structures and create definitive outcomes that will carry the movement forward in New Mexico, where he's lived for 40 years. Generations into the future, Mark is today anxious to let it be known what mistakes were made. Out of Columbia came the belief that militancy will do everything, he explained in a 2007 interview with me. We happened to be lucky at the moment. There had been base building and politicization of the campus, many years of education, confrontation, and agitation, and years of talking with people. It was real organizing that went on. But coming out of that militancy would become the strategy, which really it's only a tactic which sometimes occasionally, if you're lucky, works. The young leadership of Columbia SDS was hoping not just to understand the world, but to change it by any means necessary. Base building and long-term organizational strategies were seen as of a secondary importance. As the scope of the essays that follow shows, the uprising at Columbia University can be understood through many perspectives and stories. There is no one narrative, but many. All can be considered, however, in one common and vital way, as a microcosm of the nation's wider concerns. There remain, of course, at least as many avenues open for exploration, including those that tackle post-1968 Columbia. The university was changed forever, most immediately with the imperious, prideful president, Grayson Kirk, who in April 1968 described the young people of America as having taken refuge in a turbulent and intra-nihilism. And Vice President David Truman, both dethroned, the Columbia Senate, the policymaking legislative body with the full jurisdiction and power to deal with all matters of university-wide concern, established the following year the revision of disciplinary procedures implemented, including the dissolution of the more patronizing elements of in loco parentis, and the hiring of more Black faculty, including Charles Hamilton in the government department. By documenting the story of a generation of politically committed citizens who came of age in a world painfully out of equilibrium with those who thought to shape that world, A Time to Stir has the potential to deepen our understanding of not just the widespread social unrest that pervaded the final years of the 60s in the United States and beyond, but also the theory and practice of contemporary protest and debate. The year 1968 was a high point of an era when a fight between those who advocated rapid adjustment to the norms and values of those who were committed to maintaining traditional ideas of political and social order erupted in every direction. To delve into the campus events of that year means to explore and so let loose the range of themes that are unmistakably as germane and worthy of investigation today as they were all those years ago. Every significant beat of this story finds a contemporary analog, at least as pertinent today as it was 5 decades ago. We continue these resilient problems. We ignore these resilient problems, these present struggles, these issues and fundamental questions of culture, politics, and society at our peril. Motivated by an intention to put forth a description of historic events, to fuse the skirmishes of 1968 to the present day, adventuresome readers are challenged to ask themselves, what would I have done 50 years ago? In his final book, Hell No, The Forgotten Power of the Vietnam Peace Movement, Tom Hayden, who continues to hover inspiringly over my nearly 2 decades-long 1968 projects, Chicago and Columbia, wrote of the campaign that must be fought against loss of memory. Our digital culture is exponentially amnesic, which makes even more important the task of soliciting stories from a generation that activated itself into one of the most powerful anti-war and social justice movements in American history. Those more arcane and iconoclastic retellings of events that we might think today have exhausted are, in fact, indispensable. And so here, for today's readers and tomorrow's scholars, is a collection written by participants and witnesses, men and women whose tales need to be remembered by history. On that note, the creation of a book composed of new testimonials about student protests written 50 years after the fact. With it, the issue of range and scope, men and women who were 20 years old in 1968 are more likely to be available today for the task of remembrance than those who were, as part of Columbia's administration and faculty, middle-aged or older. As such, A Time to Stir might be said to lack balance. There are offerings from those who 5 decades ago were on Columbia's faculty, but voices from the university administration do not appear. Everyone who contributed to this book also gave an interview for an accompanying panoramic, multi-chapter documentary, which complements, expands on, and illustrates the contents of this book, making several hundred newly recorded conversations and an archive of many thousands of newly discovered photographs. My thanks to them, as well as to all my interviews over the years. Appreciation also to Neil Hurwitz for his expansive remembrances of 1968, Stacy Knecht for her thoughtful comments on the manuscript, Jocelyn Wilk at Columbia's archive and Butler Library, which houses the wondrous Protests and Activism collection, and Philip Leventhal of the Columbia University Press. When deciding what to write about, each contributor made his and her own decisions, although in some instances, I suggested certain starting points and directions in which the essays might move. While I cannot agree with everything contained in what follows, and might consider some of the descriptive language unfair and the interpretations misguided, there is nothing of import presented here that I know to be egregiously in error.